Hi, I'm Roger Aguinaldo, and welcome to the M&A Advisor podcast. Since 1998, the M&A Advisor has been the definitive source dedicated to recognizing achievement, delivering unrivaled thought leadership, and connecting the world's mergers and acquisitions elite. We help you sharpen your edge and accelerate your success in deal making. Whether you're an ambitious new player or a market veteran, this podcast provides masterclass strategies, unvarnished stories, and vital lessons from the industry's influential figures. Before we launch into this episode, be sure to follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and subscribe to our essential M&A Alerts email newsletter. Find all the links below. Your engagement fuels the deal-making community. Now let's get into the transaction.
It is a pleasure and a privilege, really, to be here with you, Secretary Ross. Can I call you Secretary Ross or Wilbur? What do you want to go by?
Thank you.
But great to be here. And as Roger just noted, Wilbur's book is available. It's a great book. It's filled with anecdotes, practical advice, wisdom over many decades of experience, called Risks and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life. So I think we could use this discussion as a bit of a preview, right, for the audience to learn from you and hear about what you wrote about in your book. And if it's all right with you, there are kind of three themes that really, I thought, permeated your story, right? And some of these themes we've talked about on other panels over the course of the day. First and foremost, relationships, right? The importance of relationships in business. Second, risks. You've been very successful by taking well-thought-through, well-timed risks. So how do you think about risk? And then third, more practically speaking, how do you get successful in terms of business negotiations? There's some very practical advice you have in the book. It's kind of a handbook from that perspective. So those are some themes that maybe we could talk about. So perhaps starting with relationships.
Well, I hope everybody has a couple of weeks, because that's how long it'll take to cover all that.
We'll do what we can in 25 minutes. So on relationships, it certainly comes through every phase of your career. You talk about in your book your parents, your classmates, your coworkers, your early mentors, people that gave you opportunities over your career. And I also liked reading about adversaries that you built relationships with that served you well over time. So maybe starting from that perspective, what could you say about relationships and how that's been successful for you?
Well, I think in any business, relationships are very, very important. When you think about it, how does business start? It starts with a sale. And if you're in the professional services business, like many of you are and like I had been, clearly relationships play a part. And that's even more true in the context of workouts, because workouts are exceedingly complex. A merger out of court is very much simpler than one in the court, because you don't have the creditor constituencies in a normal one. You don't have a judge. You don't have a U.S. trustee. So you have a lot more moving parts to it. But in terms of my own career, some people early on did give me a very, very big helping hand. And so now I'm trying to give helping hands to some of the younger people. And in fact, that's a big part of the reason why I wrote the book. I have a concern that the current very younger generation are very fragile personalities and don't have very high expectations for themselves, and they certainly are not of a mind to take a risk. So part of the purpose of the book, since I did overcome some adversities along the way, part of the reason for the book was to try to encourage people, take a risk, take a chance, be a little more aggressive. Because if you're too passive, you're just not going to get anywhere.
So that's a great segue, I think, into risks. So let's maybe dig a little bit deeper in terms of, the way you looked at risk. And I think back to, one of your earlier roles on Wall Street involving research, information and data, and how you provided that to clients. It seemed to me like that was a kind of a core part of the way you looked at risk for the rest of your career in terms of information and research. So maybe speak to that a little bit.
Well, information research has become easier with AI and all the media and all the disclosure rules that prevail. So the real premium now is not just availability of information, it's more the interpretation of it. And that really leads to the risk assessment. We have always tried, when we're investing as principal, to take apparent risk and try to avoid actual risk. Apparent risk you get paid for. Some industry goes out of favor, the paper collapses, so the market discounts it. But usually there's a disconnect in one direction or the other between the actual risk and the perceived risk. So if you're putting your own capital to work, you want to be in the one where the actual risk is not as severe as the perception that people have of it. And that's where the experience comes in. But it's also where relationships come in, because other people have thoughts on it. There are people who specialize in the particular industry. I've always been a generalist, so that makes you somewhat dependent on specialists to help you find what are the key ingredients to success for this and what are the key possibilities of causing failure. And in the distress context, in my day, and I think it may even still be true, the hardest thing in the world was to get the board of the bankrupt company to kick out the management that made them bankrupt. I found it was very, very difficult, particularly with the larger companies, because while in theory boards hire and fire managements, in reality, big companies over time evolved to where the board is largely consisting of friends of the CEO. So you're dealing with not just a commercial, not just a fiduciary relationship, you're dealing with personal relationships. So that always mystified me. But it's really important to change the management, I believe, because companies that have been under distress for quite a while, managements develop what I came to call a loser's mentality. Namely, you go to them and you say, well, what's the problem with your company? And they'll say, oh, it's the unions, or it's price competition, or it's China, or it's the government. They always name some outside factor that's basically out of their control. What they never say is, maybe I opened too many plants, or maybe the plants I did open were too big, and maybe I did too much debt financing because I didn't want to dilute the equity. You never hear them really have self-examination. So just the fact of bringing in a new person, in my view, preferably someone with industry-specific performance, industry-specific background, now you have a shot at fresh eyes looking and fresh eyes who are determined to make it work. So the whole relationship between the problems and the management becomes a structurally different one from the way it was with the old management.
And you touched on a couple of things there that also come through in the book in terms of how to look at variables, right? You're talking about management teams that maybe there are variables that were outside of their control, but weren't necessarily prepared for in a manner that I know you've done over time in your career. When you're looking at issues, disruptive forces that aren't in your control, how can you prepare for different conditionalities?
Well, the first thing is to be pretty sure that you have a comprehensive list as to what can go wrong, and then have in mind a program. What will you do if that bad contingency comes up? That's the first thing, is to be prepared. And I think that's true of negotiations. The most important thing is good preparation for it, and even more so if you're putting money into a thing that needs a turnaround. The other thing is you need to be patient. It always takes longer than your most conservative guess as to how long it will take to turn the thing around. And so you need to be prepared and capitalized well enough to survive if it really does take longer for things to be made better.
Yeah, in terms of where that kind of segues into nicely is negotiations, right? And I think you've had some, obviously, look, you've done literally thousands of negotiations over the course of your career, and you're in a room where I'd venture to guess virtually all of us negotiate for a living. So I think there's, I'm sure, a lot that all of us can learn from your experience.
Right.
So what do you think? What does it take to be successful in business negotiations?
Well, I think in terms of negotiation, there are several things. Again, preparation. And by preparation, I mean figuring out what really is your limit. How far are you truly prepared to go? But even more importantly, what are the hot buttons that whoever is on the other side has? What are the points that they're just not going to give as far as you can figure out? And that leaves the mass of things in the middle where you have some flexibility and where you believe your other side also has flexibility. So I think that's the single most important thing. The second most important thing is figuring out, is it your side or the other side that is truly the most prepared to walk away from the table? Because whoever is the most prepared and most courageously willing to walk away, that guy has an edge. And if you handle the negotiations correctly, the other side will come to understand that a breaking up of the negotiations will be more painful for them than it is for you. Third thing is I like to start with the easy points, the easy open points, where probably neither side gives that much of a concern, and try to get them out of the way so you start an attitude of cooperation. Because think about it, what is a negotiation? It's really two people each trying to sell the other that his point of view is the correct one. So it's better to start, get some consensus built, get a feeling of momentum. I don't like big dramatic things, don't like bluffing. I think bluffing is the worst idea in the whole world, because the problem with bluffing is you're very likely to get called, and once you're called and you yield on a point that you had claimed was a sticking point, now you've lost all credibility, and so the guy's not going to believe any other stated points you have. The only worse thing than bluffing is lying, and some people come up with lies in negotiation, and I have never seen that really work. As long as the people in the negotiation are grown-ups and halfway prepared, lying doesn't work. Third mortal sin is reneging. often if negotiations go on too long, you get to a point of deal fatigue. And then people start to think, well, I think he gave on that point 2 weeks ago. Now he's reneging. So a bad will starts to come in on things that lag too long. But in some cases, people actually do renege, and that's total poison because, again, you're losing the credibility that you would have otherwise had. So I think credibility building toward a consensus, those are all important things. But at the end of the day, if the people you're negotiating against are serious, grown-up people who've done their homework, nobody is going to get a 90-10 victory. It just doesn't work that way. If you're lucky, you may get 55-45, 60-40, something like that. But the idea of a home run where the other side is just totally demolished, I don't see it really happening except under the most peculiar of circumstances. So setting your own expectations correctly is very important. I also don't like the idea of negotiating all night long. Even when I was younger and could do it, I thought it was not good because people get tired, they get irritated, they get balky. It's not helpful. What you want is smooth, you want calm, you want consensual. That should be the mindsets that you have, not confrontational. Now, sometimes you can't avoid it. In the book, you'll read the way I first met President Trump was quite confrontational. What had happened was he was financing the Trump Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City, a startup casino. And he had gotten Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns to underwrite some first mortgage bonds for him to complete the construction. The bonds sold very well. The only problem is they never paid one interest payment. They defaulted by the time of the first payment. So the bondholders were naturally quite cross with him, and so they hired me to try to help them recoup their losses. Their bonds that they had bought less than a year before were trading at 20 cents on the dollar. That's how bad the situation was. So they hired me the Thursday just before Memorial Day weekend. And as soon as it came over the news ticker that I was hired, Trump called and he said, "You must come down to Atlantic City tomorrow and we'll start the discussion." Well, the last place I wanted to be for Memorial Day weekend was in Atlantic City with tens of thousands of people playing slot machines. But it was a new assignment, and I felt I had to do it. So went out to the heliport, got into what was obviously his helicopter. It was obvious because in nail-polished red, gigantic letters on the side, it said Trump. So that made it easy to find. About 35 minutes later, we land in Atlantic City on the remnants of the old steel pier, and he's there in a big stretch limo waiting for me. And as I got into the car, I noticed there were two flags on the front bumper of the car, and one was a U.S. flag. The other was a Trump flag. And the Trump flag was a little bigger than the U.S. flag. So that was my first exposure to his gift for understatement. Anyhow, so we go get into the casino, get through this mob of people swarming, and they were clearly very excited to see him. He had become, at least with the gambling community, a kind of cult figure. So people were having him sign their beanies, signed their notepad. One lady was in a bareback dress. She had him sign her back, and I don't know what she was going to do with that. But anyhow, there was a lot of crowd excitement. We then go upstairs to start negotiating, and Trump begins it in his usual extreme fashion, which is something people have still not gotten accustomed to with his present job. So he announced that, as I know, the bonds are trading at 20 cents, and he said my bondholders be lucky to get 20% at the end of the day. So instead of a lot of bickering, I should just agree to the 20 cents, and he'll personally guarantee it so we can all have a nice time. I said, well, Donald, the problem is bondholders want par plus their accrued interest plus shares in the casinos, so we have a little value disconnect. We went at it for a couple hours, and I got no place. He didn't move one single penny. So even though it's not something I would normally do, I said, well, Donald, is that where you are as of today, 20 cents, period? He said, yes, that's it. I said, well, then I'm not going to waste my time here, and I walked out on him. Now, that was a shock to him because that was the kind of tactic he was used to using with other people. So it was a little bit of corporate jujitsu to use his tactic on himself. Anyway, so it dragged on month after month through the summer, but we were gradually getting closer to what my constituents wanted. So finally, one morning in October, when we were very, very close, I went over to see him and said, Donald, today is the day. We've been at this long enough. We're pretty close. You got to close the gap. And if you don't, we're going to file an involuntary bankruptcy petition. And tomorrow morning, you're going to be in Chapter 11 with the casino. So we then had a few more discussions during the day, but it didn't get anywhere. So I went back to my office, put out a press release that said that 5 o'clock this evening, the bondholders of Taj Mahal are going to have an important press conference at the Marriott Marquis Hotel. We picked the Marriott because it wasn't one of his properties. So as soon as he saw that, he called me and he said, what is this? What is this about a press conference? What the hell are you going to say? I said, well, Donald, I told you today was the day, and if we couldn't do it, we're going to put you in Chapter 11. We have the papers ready to file, and at 5 o'clock, we're going to announce that we just filed the papers. So some more discussions then ensued. We finally made a deal. By now, it was early afternoon, and as you can appreciate, this was a pretty stressful day after some stressful months fighting with him and publicly bickering with him. Anyhow, so he said, and one more thing, and I had been with him enough to know when he said, and one more thing, it was usually a real zinger. In this case, the one more thing was we had to move the press conference to the Plaza Hotel, which was one of his, instead of the Marriott. So we did. Press conference went well. We made it a consensual Chapter 11 and explained to people the gamblers' debts would all be paid. There was no people were going to be fired, no nothing. It was just the technicalities of a friendly Chapter 11 that we were going to go through to implement the deal. So that's over with. So I get into the car to be driven home, and the phone rings, and it's my mother. And she said, "This is your mother," in just that angry a tone. "Oh, hi, Mom, everything okay?" "No, nothing is okay. I've been playing mahjong with my friends, and we watched that disgusting press conference you put on with Trump, and we all feel that after he said all those mean things about you, you shouldn't have made a deal with him. I said, well, but Mom, that's what I do. That's how I make my living. And she said, well, if you would only become a lawyer like I always wanted you to, you wouldn't have to hang around with people like that. And she hung up on me. She eventually forgave me for making the deal with Trump. She never did forgive me for not becoming a lawyer. So that's the one time where a sort of showbiz type tactic like walking out I felt was important, because I thought it was very important at the beginning of the negotiation to let him know that all this bluster wasn't going to get anywhere, that he had to get serious. He knew we were never going to accept 20 cents, so it was a waste of time to spend too much time debating something that was never going to happen. And if you follow through his negotiations in other things, all those characteristics are true. Start with an extreme, do it very publicly, eventually come to a sensible transaction. So I think it simply proves the point that you don't need to do a lot of bluster to get to a reasonable result. But you do need to be prepared. You do need to be strong in your position. And I feel when you turn down some element of what the other side proposed, you ought to have a fairly detailed explanation why that doesn't work for you. Just saying, oh no, hell, I'll never do that, I don't think works. I like to make it more two people trying to get to the same logical conclusion that works for both sides. And I think that's the best mindset for that process.
Well, the way you approached that negotiation clearly left an impression, given that several decades later, Donald Trump selected you as his Secretary of Commerce.
Yes.
So that's a fantastic and great preview of the war stories that are really chock full in your book. I know we're out of time, but one last question perhaps, and kind of tying it back to advice, right, and to the next generation. And in the room we have lots of folks that are building practices, building businesses, taking risks in doing so. What piece of advice might you give to that next generation in terms of how to build a business?
Well, the first thing would be start with the assumption that if you're going to be a serial entrepreneur, either by being the founder of a business or by creating portfolios of companies that are less functioning than they might be, get accustomed to the idea there will be failures. Every successful entrepreneur that I know has had failures along the way. The difference is some people just get crushed by that and they go back to some mediocre job working for someone else. But the ones who instead learn something from what was the mistake they made that led to the failure, and then try to build back, find another thing to do. Most dramatic one of my earlier clients, not a distressed client, was a company called Cravath Laboratories. They were very big players in the generic drug industry, and I took them public and did a lot of things with them. Anyhow, the first venture that the proprietor went into was the following. His father had died, left him a little bit of money, so he started a laundromat. And 3 months later, the laundromat failed. So he took what little was left and said, well, I had been working at one of the big pharmaceuticals. He was a chemist. And so maybe I should not try to do a consumer retail business. Maybe I should try knocking off drugs as their patents expired and doing them cheaply. worked out very well. So he had an abject failure in no time at all in his first venture, and then had an enormous success. When I took him public, he went directly to the Forbes 400 list. So it was a remarkable change from a busted laundromat to a very successful generic drug company.
Well, that's fantastic advice and a great story. Thank you, Secretary. And if you haven't picked up the book yet, it's on a table right outside of the room. And I think we'll have some time for a meet and greet with Secretary Ross.
Yeah, there's a table out there, and I'm happy to sign and personalize books for you. And if you found this at all worthwhile or entertaining, take a book. They're free. Roger is taking some of his great wealth and donating the books to you. So you're very fortunate not to have to pay.
Okay, and Wilbur has named me in your will, right, too, so that I'll get some additional great wealth, right? So, Wilbur, you're such a great friend, a great partner of M&A Advisor all these years. 2008, was our second year we had our Turnaround Awards, and you graciously you and Hillary opened your house. We have pictures online with Wilbur at his estate here in Palm Beach, and because of you, we've been coming back for 20 years. So it's apropos that we, come back every year. And thank you. Please give a big hand to Evan and to Wilbur for this.
We hope today's episode delivered actionable intelligence. We want to hear from the field. Share your questions or insights, leave a message on your favorite platform, or email us at editor@maadvisor.com. To secure your steady feed of premium M&A content, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and subscribe to our M&A Alerts email newsletter. Find the links in the description below or visit us directly at our website at www.maadvisor.com. I'm Roger Aguinaldo, founder and CEO of the M&A Advisor. Thank you for being part of the M&A Advisor community. Until next time, stay decisive, stay connected, and happy dealing.